I think a standing ovation is an eloquent expression of thank you for what you've just given us. It's really a wonderful lecture. I have some time to begin a question period, and I think there may be some chance at the end for a few questions from the audience as well. But I want to begin sort of where you began, and that was 5 Canadian guys going off to cover a war. And you repeatedly pointed out, oh, there was her story.
I talked about facts first, so it's 6.
6, sorry, a fact checker here. Ideas is always slightly behind on facts. So.
My mother has to pay for the CBCs, so we must get it right.
Because 6 guys go off to war, but you pointed out at least 2 or 3 times, you said it's her story too. It's her story too. And what I want to ask you about, and it wasn't necessarily a topic of the lecture, but it's something that you're more than capable of commenting on. Why are there so many female war correspondents? And it does go back to this, it goes back before the Second World War, but Gellhorn was the big voice in the Second World War. Then it comes on, and in Canada, and I can speak as a CBC radio person, Anna Maria Tremonti and Carol Off both cut their teeth in war zones. And you're not an exception either, although you don't work for the CBC. Why are women in some ways overrepresented in that category? And have been for a long time.
Is this turning from analysis into complaint now? Hashtag way to go, men. Yes, and we grew up with Anne Medina, who was reporting from Lebanon. Barbara Frum, of course, was a heroine for us all. But I'm so relieved you put it that way, because, and with all due respect, if there are any journalism students here who are planning to call me up, is that they call up and say, hi, I'm doing a report about gender in journalism, and I'd like to know about women war correspondents. And I think we have come to the time where that our journalism should not be defined by our gender, but it should be defined by who we are. And this is actually something which I didn't talk about, but I was quite interested in Peter's time, because I often say that for me what defines journalism is the questions that we ask. And the questions come from who we are, about where we grew up, about our own history. And so Peter's history was so interesting because he brought together so many different cultures, and he himself was an immigrant too. And I'm sure that fed into the kinds of questions he was asked, what he looked for, perhaps it was what inspired him when he heard the peasants singing Lily Marlene, that he realized this was something that struck such a chord for the soldiers, for the people. It was really part of the whole, the music of the war, if you like. So when it comes to women, there are so many good women journalists now. You mentioned, some of my friends who, some of my very good friends, Anna Maria Tremonti, Carol Off, Adrian Arsenault, who's now with the new anchors on the National. We often met on different fronts around the world, different stories. And the new generation has so many women correspondents. And I think it's a very good thing, because I think we need men, we need women, we need people from all kinds of different backgrounds, because the more different questions we ask, the more we'll be better informed about the stories of our time.
And I suppose it doesn't really have a gender issue. I mean, I'm allergic to bullets. It's probably why I'm the host of Ideas, right? Like these are really imaginary bullets or whatever that I have. Carol Off is a good friend of mine. She sort of, I won't say she loves bullets, but she really doesn't mind having them fly over her head, and that's something that bothers me. And it's an interesting dilemma that among the people I know who have been attracted not to foreign correspondency, but to war correspondency, many of them have been women.
It's because this used to be my reply when I would get called by journalism students who were doing their theses on women war correspondents. And by the way, for the record, I don't regard myself as a war correspondent. I'm a correspondent who sometimes covers elections and sometimes
we have too many wars. So
yes, and sometimes covers conflict. And my wish would be that I cover more elections than I'm covering conflicts. But my answer would always be that I know as many men who are interested in the human side of war as I know women who are interested in the ballistics of war. And even though I know you say you're allergic to bullets, but let me give you a little bit of an exclusive bit of information tonight, that bullets don't have names on them and they don't have gender assigned to them. So actually the bullets that were you said you're allergic to, they would probably be heading either for you or for Carol with no distinction. But it still remains to be said. And again, this is back to who we are as journalists. Some people, for example, in my case, that I think one of these qualities or the skills that I have, if I have any, is that I come from New Brunswick. I come from a place where people are really friendly. They talk to people. They ask questions to people. I mean, anyone who takes the train from Ottawa to Halifax knows that when the train leaves the station from Montreal, suddenly the carriages become more chatty, more talkative, more laughing. And when I went to school at University of Queen's, many Canadians said to me, "Oh, you come from New Brunswick. I thought Canada stopped at Montreal." And it wasn't a joke, actually. But who we are as people, and being female or male is part of that. But it still has to be said that there are some parts of the world, very traditional societies, very conservative societies, where access to women is controlled by the men. And those are areas where women do have an advantage, because they can both get the trust of the men who hold the keys to the door, but also the women, because if you're at times of war, and often not even at times of war, when you're asking people to tell you their most intimate secrets, and it's a universal human thing that women find it easier to talk to other women. And it's very interesting in what will be seen as one of the greatest reminders, if one was needed, of the power of journalism, is that the two journalists, Megan Toohey and Jodi Kantor, who wrote the two New York Times stories, who broke is probably not the right word, who wrote the story about 30 years of abuse by Harvey Weinstein, they said that it helped that they were women, because they were talking to other women. They had a female editor. It's not the only reason. The main reason was that they did good journalism. And when they were asked, why did you do these stories? And this is truly a story which has gone viral. It has given a new meaning to the word viral around the world. When they were asked why they did this story, they replied, "We did it for our daughters. We did it because we want our daughters to grow up in a world safer for women," and it should be added, safer for men as well.
You mentioned the New Brunswick friendliness as something that was an advantage. I when I was floundering around trying to introduce you, mentioned the possibility of a sort of a historical or almost ethnic background as a refugee. And do you think that has actually helped you look at the world as a foreign correspondent for the BBC? I mean, do you bring this, not baggage, but lens on the world that comes from being raised as an Acadian, which gives you sensitivity to sensible matters that are very much present?
I think when you study history, and I think it behoves all of us to know where we come from, because it is very much a big part of who we are, you can't help but be taken by the history of the Acadians, the history of any peoples who've been forced from their homes, and that would include the First Nations of Canada as well. Everyone who loses their sense of self or place from not being able to go back to where all of their memories began is a huge jolting experience, an experience I'm sure which is seared in their sense of self. But I do have to say that when I left Canada and first went to Africa to try to become a journalist, and then I would keep coming back to Canada, but in between those years I'd keep meeting people who weren't able to go home. I have to say that I think one of the greatest gifts of all is to be able to go home. I mean, the fact that I can get on a plane, fly to Ottawa, and then fly back to London, England, where I live now. It seems like such a simple thing, but it is something which is denied to millions of people around the world, not being allowed to go home. Can you imagine that? When you can, who in this audience, if you want to say, cannot go home? Is there anyone here tonight? Is there a few? Well, we're all very lucky if we can.
Very lucky.
Yeah.
There was one. I want to push another thing, and this is very self-serving, I guess, but you were talking about Peter Stursberg. You were talking about a great, not a renaissance, a naissance of Canadian correspondence in a foreign setting. And you were talking about radio. You were talking about the sounds of the guns, the sounds of the bagpipes, the sounds of the church bells. Now, I full disclosure right up front, yes, I work in radio. And you work in both. Predominantly, I would think, though, as a television journalist, you're defined as such. Do you compare the two media in terms of their expressibility? I mean, if you were to choose, let's imagine a new war someplace on another continent that doesn't exist someplace, but you were sent there to correspond, to tell us what was happening. Would you rather have a microphone or a camera?
I do online.
You'd rather have none. Yeah, that's it.
No, I'll do online. All right.
Oh, okay, online, that's the future.
No, I don't think, probably everyone, a lot of people here live with both TV, radio, and of course more and more with our digital lives. But in terms of my own reporting, since you asked, I always think of bringing radio to television and bringing television to radio, which is that when I do television, I think about bringing the kind of analysis and the context that we're so much more it's easier to do on radio because you have more time. But with radio, I think bringing television to it, to paint the pictures, to tell people what I'm seeing, the red flower in the bush, the pink scarf worn by the girl, the toy that's been left in, in the dark mound of rubble. Because it's that whole thing and this is what I loved when Peter Stursberg, the kind of dispatches they did in the Second World War were much longer, and I think they had greater liberty, and they told us everything when he confessed to his that insecurity, can I read, can I do this justice? I can't, there's no way I can exaggerate the hardship of this terrible war, and will my words be real enough? And it's that painting of the picture, painting of a picture on radio and not analyzing it on television. So I think you need both to kind of develop all the skills that you need to be kind of, as a journalist, you're kind of an envoy being sent by others who either don't want or can't go to the places that we go. And so your job is to bring back. It's a huge, it's a privilege, but it's also a responsibility to convey the fullness of what you see.
And what's amazing, particularly about that golden age, and it was a real golden age. I mean, we were in the green room just before it came in, and it was wonderful to watch Lyse because she's going over her notes, and I could sense the excitement as you relived hearing those reports, and those reports are
I love listening to those. I love listening to the reports. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, what it does is it takes you back in a way that I'm a lapsed historian. I was previously, so yeah, journalism is, I guess, the front lines of history. This is we lay down the front lines.
Draft, yes.
But what it does is it brings it back in full sort of sensual glory, and you can see it all or feel it all, whether you see it if you're listening to radio or feel it or hear it while you're watching television. It's all there, and it's a great privilege to do that.
Yeah, I was really struck by, because if you think about how long ago that was, but if you were teaching a journalism class, he did a lot of the things that you would tell journalists today, like, focus on those little details, in his case, draw your listeners in, and he used all these different advices. And that when he said, listen to the roar of the guns, he said, come with me, listen to me. I want you to stop what you're doing, listen to me, listen to those guns. And then you hear all the sounds that Big Betsy was able to mix. And then it was really revolutionary, for radio then, to be able to mix so that you have the sound of the correspondent's voice and the sounds of the war behind them. And it seems so simple now, but actually that was the first time that they did that sort of thing.
And what was wonderful, I mean, I learned that from Peter, from Richard, talking about Peter earlier this evening, I guess from Peter too, but what was that Canadians were, in a sense, on a cutting edge of the technology, so that what Peter Stursberg was doing in Italy or in Holland or wherever he was also being picked up and heard in Britain and heard all through the United States. And so in a sense, the technology and the fact that we were there doing it meant that Canadians were bringing the war not just to the radios and living rooms and kitchens of Canada, but also to the rest of the Allied effort in some ways. I mean, we were very much not just covering it for Canada.
The BBC didn't have that technology. The American networks didn't have that technology. It was, plucky Canadian engineers and technicians who came up with that the person they called Big Betsy, that it really was in its time. It was, as you say, it was cutting edge. So I think it's something to be proud of, because here it is, Canada, the colony, both Britain and France ended up, at least beating them at what was an important part of the war effort. So I think and actually I hadn't realized that, I don't know whether people here, that a Canadian invented radio. I didn't realize until I was actually looking through, was it Reginald Fessenden?
Fessenden,
Yeah. They actually invented radio. I had never known that. How many people knew that? Oh my God.
More than
Dumbo.
actually don't have a place to go home. I want to spend a few moments, just a few, talking about Ali too, because I thought that was a really wonderful thing to bring up. And you said something about him that I think was really profound, and that was that he learned that the good guys were the bad guys.
Oh, his story really. Again, people who can, when you have to pick up everything and leave your home and not knowing whether you can go back, and for him in that kind of a close-knit traditional society, to be a journalist most of all, hugely brave beyond brave. He paid such a heavy personal price, but he was so invested with this sense of, I've seen this. He was brought into that unit, they trusted him, they saw him as one of the family, so they started doing things in front of him that he should never have seen, and I'm sure he never wanted to see. But having seen them, he thought that this is something the world should see. Extraordinary.
I'll ask one more question. I don't know if there's time for more from the floor, but
Thanks.
But this is. I loved your 7 W's, which I'd never heard before. I mean, obviously I heard about the 5. I never went to journalism school, but
they don't teach the 6th in journalism school.
And it might not make it onto the radio either. But number 7 really impressed me, and it impressed me because, I'm the host of a program called Ideas. That means I guess I'm supposed to have big thoughts, and they're all at least multisyllabic. Wow is probably the word that comes out of my mouth more often than any other word. And I feel marginally embarrassed by that sometimes, that I should have bigger words, or I should have.
Everyone understands it.
But it is what keeps me in journalism, I guess. And if what I'm doing is journalism, then don't tell anybody, because they might have to pay me for it. But wow is something that is the factor that I find most exciting, not just in what I do, which has not a lot to do with war, or even with foreign relations or foreign affairs. And it brings me into what you do, too. I mean, I think wow is a common factor among all journalists, and praise the Lord, or whatever. Thank you. It's wonderful to have shared it. And I think...
You can steal it from me.
I didn't steal. No, but you have a real wow factor, and it won't go away. It won't go away. Will it? I mean...
You're only as good as our next story. I mean, maybe my next one, people say, wow, she's really lost it.
What is your next story?
Going to Saudi Arabia.
Wow. I don't know if there is. Is there time, Susan, for more questions, or? Yes. Okay. Yes.
Montana Hunter from King's College in London. First of all, thank you very much.
Were you on my flight?
No, I now live in Ottawa as of very recently. I had the privilege of working with a young journalist in Ukraine while I was there about a year ago. Christopher Allen was his name. And I've been thinking about him quite a lot because, just recently, because last week I listened to his funeral. He was killed while embedded in a unit in Sudan. So my question for you, I guess, is how do we balance the importance of being in person and reporting on conflicts in the world with the danger there of the unconventional wars going on right now? Thank you.
It's a big, thank you very much for your question. There's a very old maxim in war reporting, which probably goes back to the very first wars that first war correspondents covered. And that is that no story is worth dying for. But we live in a time where we say, but there are stories that are worth taking risks for. And the problem is, and this is, I'm sure, was what happened, is that tragically, is that you often don't really know the risks or don't want to know the risks until it's too late. And then you do pay the biggest price. But it's a hard thing. And I've said even 20 years ago when I was in Afghanistan, I used to say that the bravest journalist of all is the journalist who says, I'm not going in that helicopter. I know everyone else in the press pack is going in that helicopter, but I'm not going because I don't think it's safe enough. And I'm not going in that convoy into a contested zone because I don't believe it's safe enough. There's pressures from your colleagues, pressures from the editors, but I think more and more, I know at the BBC and I'm sure at CBC as well, in fact, the opposite is happening. I was talking to some NBC journalists who told me that they're only allowed to say 6 hours in Kabul because it's too dangerous. And even some BBC people who went stayed 2 hours. So people are pulling back. And but as you say, it's where to find that balance. It's a big question.
Another question?
I'm a Carleton student. I'm not in journalism though, so pardon me if this is a bit of an amateur question. With regards to your kind of 5+ Ws, and how you use those, or I guess any journalist would use those as a vehicle for delivering truth, really. How would you go about doing that in a situation where, for example, the why is so subjective and it's never really a one-dimensional issue? How do you interpret truth and then put that forward in your work?
The why is very interesting. I've been thinking about why recently. This is not something that I talked about here, but there was something else I was looking at. And so I'm not a person who likes to look, I've never been interested in Star Trek and Star Wars, looking at the future. But suddenly, in my own profession, what's called robot journalism is starting. And there's been a prediction that in 5 years, a computer could win a Pulitzer Prize, and that 90% of our stories could be written by computers. But one thing the computer can't do now, they can do, because you feed them the data, who, what, when, where. They can't do the why. They can't think or analyze or interpret. They're working on it, but that's the one thing, one of many things that separates us from those machines. And you're right, the why is the context, and that's where prejudices, biases, the facts, that you want to, you can give preference to some facts over some facts. I mean, at the BBC and at the CBC, we're kind of on the one hand, on the other hand, we're supposed to give context, which is different from having an opinion. But you have to work really hard. And I think we can't say that just because we're the so-called mainstream media that we know storytelling better than the rest, because we are very selective too in our choice of the facts. And I am always reminded that when I do one more interview, that my perception of the story, the way the story should go, always changes. And we have this expression in journalism, and for some people it's not just an expression, the story that's too good to check. That you think, wow, it's so fantastic, wow, I'm not going to call and find out if it's true, and it's there's one of the TV channel in Britain whose mantra is never wrong for long. Just get it, just get it out there, and okay, it's wrong, we'll just get on to the next story. But you're absolutely right. You should apply for journalism school.
Hi, you've talked a lot about storytelling tonight and evoking emotions in people, since giving people facts in stories doesn't usually move them. So there's been a movement towards storytelling in journalism, but I'm wondering what you can say about how far you go with that and how you avoid kind of manipulating people's emotions, since that is a common thread in misinformation and fake news is trying to manipulate people's emotions. How do you use some of that without going over the line?
We have to be, could I just be really trite and trivial for just a moment? There's been a mystery to me that people say that what defines Canadians is how they say about, and you pronounced it, about or whatever. It was exactly very Canadian, so I thought, that's it, that's it. Please, would you please give me that bit of the recording, because that's what I but your question is very good. I fundamentally believe that all of these complicated, complex, consequential stories of our time are, when you drill down to them, human stories. And when I began in journalism, I always reminded myself, this is to be a story that my mother is interested in, who lives in New Brunswick, very far from a lot of the places that I go to. So I think that's how we can begin to understand and, as importantly, care, but more importantly, care about stories. But there is a danger, and you're right to point it out, that in just focusing on the human side of it, the emotion, that you don't give the broader context. And this was a problem in Syria, where the Western media tended to focus on the very real human story, whereas the Russian and the Chinese and other media focused on the terrorism story. And in order to really understand the story of Syria, for example, the siege of the city of Aleppo and the bombardment of the rebel-held east by Russian and Syrian warplanes, the full story was, yes, that children were being targeted in the hospitals, the clinics, and the homes, because that's where the bombs were falling. But people also had to understand what was the politics of the place, which groups were controlling the area, which ones were linked to Al-Qaeda, where was Islamic State, and it doesn't take away from the fact that terrible things, terrible potential war crimes were being committed, and not just by one side in this war. But you also have to understand what is driving this war, where is it heading, who are the various sides in this war, and where are they going to take the war. So it's always finely balanced. And the problem with television is that it tends to go for the short, simple, stark narrative, and which on radio you always have more time. So you want to have something which draws people in on TV, and that means you sometimes tell the strongest story of all without all of the necessary details, which is why we should also be having long reads, we should be watching TV documentaries. In a world in which we seem to have so little time, we do have to make time to try to see the bigger picture. But that's a good question, thank you. Such good questions in this audience. The Canadian War Museum must be attractive.
Unfortunately, there's time for one more question,
more.
but
Yeah, there's always the one right here. My question, and a part of it is you already answered, is the challenges that face not just international journalists, but all journalists of all stripes. In this day and age of social media, where the people consume news just as they consume instant noodles, we live in a time where people want quick, don't really have the time necessarily to go deep into the insights. And a related question is, with so many conflicts going on in the world, how do you prioritize? Why is it that Mogadishu, where 350 people lost their lives a couple of weeks ago, only receives 2 minutes of coverage, whereas an attack on Paris that kills 20 people, or an attack on New York where some lone madman runs over and 8 people lose their lives, seems to go on days and days? Do we live in a time of desensitization? Is it the case that 10 people who lose their lives in a Western world, is that a bigger story than 350 people who die in an Asian or in an African country? Is it who you make the shots, or who decides that? Sorry, that might be a bit of a rant.
Is there a third PhD thesis you'd like me to talk about? First of all, social media. It is a challenge. It is a huge challenge to journalism and to who we are as consumers. There's a lot. The research is being done now is how, because we're accessing it on our smartphone. I mean, apparently, and we're constantly challenging our editors at the BBC. They say the average time, and I don't have the exact figures, but it's roughly, people send 20 seconds. They go to a video, and if they don't like what they see, they just keep, wipe. And what's happening, not just at the BBC, but I think at the CBC too and others, is that we do these carefully crafted, edited films from wherever we are, the best of our journalism, and then the BBC takes them and hacks it up and puts a minute 30 on the mobile use or the computers, and it has to start with a very sharp image, a face or something human, And we say, come on, this is the best of our journalism. Why don't you put up the 4-minute piece? They say, nobody's going to watch it. And we say, yes, they are going to watch it. And they say, no, they're not going to watch it. They want the 1 minute 30, wipe. And they won't stay with it unless it really grabs them. And this, I think, it's that classic question which has been asked since time eternal about, are we giving people what they want, or are people taking what we give them? I fundamentally believe, and there's lots of information coming out, that people are reading long reads, and that people do want to understand more than just, as we say, the clickbait. But there's a lot of scientific research now about, in the same way that our journalism is becoming smaller bites, that our attention span is coming in smaller bites. And there's long been this discussion about attention versus information, and our attention spans are now so quick that it's fracturing both our sense of the world and where we consume information, and it has huge consequences if it continues the way it is. But I was recently at, every year in London they have these proms, and the BBC, the best of classical music, and the BBC invites people to come and sit in one of their boxes. So I was in one of them, and one person from The Economist was there. And I introduced myself, and I said, you all know The Economist, serious journalism. And I thought, oh God, there's someone who's going to help me, ammunition. So I said, I'm so worried, in between one opera to the next, so worried, the BBC now. Can you imagine 1 minute 30 for, the best of our journalism? And so I'm sitting there expecting him to say yes. He goes, 1 minute 30? He goes, wow, that's a long time. We do 30-second ones. And I thought, oh my goodness. And on the Mogadishu question, it is shameful. It is shameful. That was, even for a country torn by war, that absolutely shattered, as you know, Somali society. And at a time when it was just beginning to make progress in trying to allow people to have a life worth living. But again, these are questions that people have pondered and argued about for time immemorial. And if you had sitting here, and I don't know, maybe you'd be the one, or maybe Richard will be the one who says, listen, people will say 350 in Mogadishu, they're always dying in Mogadishu. I'm being crude now, this is not what I say. Hundreds are dying, they've been dying for decades. But Paris, people never die in Paris like that. There's never been 20 people dying in Paris. I was with one of our colleagues from our BBC Persian service, and she had been at an explosion in a schoolyard very close to where children were gathering in Iraq. And she called up London and said, I have never seen anything like this. And people on the ground are saying they have never seen any of this. The carnage on the ground. And then London says, oh, sorry, can't talk to you. 2 people have died. And, sorry, we can't, 2 people have died in London. And it's always said to be, it's the kind of the barometer of how different is this story? Is this something which surprises us, shocks us? Does it take us away from our understanding of how things, the usual state of affairs, if you like? But there is also, and I think we can't just be negative tonight, because the fight back has started. And there are now many people on social media. And this is where social media is a great gathering of great ideas, and not just ideas, but things to do. People, are, and unfortunately it's maybe a little bit of is just sort of computer active, being a computer warrior. But people are pointing it out and saying, look, we have to be concerned about this. And people are talking about it. And that is where social media is a great gift of our time. It's a huge global forum where we can discuss those kinds of issues and push back. And I'm a big believer in that the more that we ask questions, the more we'll get the better answers to the questions and the problems of our time. So thank you for asking those questions tonight. And I'll look forward to reading your PhD thesis on them.
Thank you. And Susan, would you like to close the evening?
Thank you very much for coming. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Lyse, for a wonderful, riveting lecture, as always. Thank you, Paul, for your excellent moderation.
Thank you.
A few quick thanks, because I know we've kept you late. From Carleton, I'd like to extend our thanks to André Plourde, Dean of the Faculty of Public Affairs. To Rebecca Murray over here, who was instrumental in helping Judith and Richard. To our production team, Karen Kelly and Leo Solano, responsible for the video you saw and the programs you're holding. From the Canadian War Museum, Yasmin Minguet, and her wonderful team, Pam Bowles and Jarrett Bartlett. Thank you so much. And most of all, thank you for making the time to come out to this, this first Peter Stursberg Foreign Correspondence Lecture. I hope we see you all next year. Safe travels home. Thank you.